Greetings, fellow readers. Author Jonathan Yeakey here, and welcome to the most important writing tips ever, where we give you just the tips and so much more. Today is an award-winning author of books like Me, Myself, and Him, Middle School, and Stranded, Chris Tebbetts. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Sure, thanks for having me. Thanks to Holly Schindler for hooking us up.
Let me start off by saying that you and I share a similar educational background. We both went to Midwestern colleges and studied mass media. So how did you go from TV and film to the literary arts?
I'm really ready for this question because it's one of the things I talk about in all of my school visits to kids, where it wasn't until I was actually pulling together my website and I had to do that bio page that I started to realize, I started to put together, the progression of my interests from childhood through adulthood. And in retrospect, it was all one kind of storytelling or another that I was interested in. I had a real sort of full circle experience, which is to say I was a voracious reader as a kid who then fell in, I also watched way too much TV as a kid, which is not irrelevant here. And then I fell in to theater in middle school and high school. That was really my very favorite thing to do. But I also fell in love with movie making and movies and decided to be a film major in college because that seemed like a good opportunity to really take advantages of the resources filmmaking-wise that a college campus would have to offer. Spent 4 years figuring out that I didn't want to make movies for a living. I just like going to the movies. Fell back into theater, spent my 20s in New York doing theater, didn't like the city, moved to Vermont, started writing more seriously, and then really eventually came full circle around to books. Which it felt like this at the time, but it really was storytelling, and a matter of finding the kind of storytelling that made me want to not just create the stories, but also do what I call the business side, the other part of showing up for the business, which was all of a sudden when I found writing and specifically writing for kids, I was just organically motivated to look for an agent to put up with the kind of rejections that I wasn't willing to put up with in the other businesses I had tried, and to do all of those things that you really need to do to make it, at least to turn it into a career.
Now, usually I ask my guests what their favorite books are, but as one film buff to another, I want to know what your favorite movie is.
My all-time favorite movie is Harold and Maude. I grew up in this little hippie town, and the little art theater would have Harold and Maude once a year. And I discovered it at age 12, stayed for the 7 and 9 o'clock show, came back the next night, and came back the next night after that. I think I've seen it 15 times. It really spoke to me in a lot of ways and still does. I just watched it again recently. It still holds up for me. But in a more contemporary sense, right near the top of the list, I'd say is The Matrix, maybe. Huge fan of that movie.
And what lessons about writing or storytelling did you learn from those films?
That's a good question. I use a clip from The Matrix in one of my workshops, and in fact, just filmmaking in general. Again, I was a film major, and I really do like to look at the way filmmakers use their own toolbox to make storytelling choices. Why do we go in close? Why do we pull back? Why do we have a long shot? And what would that translate to on the page in terms of the proportional amount of time we spend with those camera angles, what those camera angles are saying. Whenever I'm starting a scene, I think, what do I want to show the reader, or what would the character notice, which translates as where would I put the camera? So I don't know, in terms of writing, I'm not sure, I'm not coming up with a great answer vis-a-vis The Matrix, but I do notice the sort of the filmmaking technique as it translates to the page.
Now, Chris, you've collaborated quite a bit with James Patterson. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's pronounced Patterson.
Patterson.
Yeah.
Pardon me. How did that come about, and what's the writing process like?
In terms of how it came about, one of the things that I did early on when I was pre-published and that I learned about along the way was something called book packagers. I don't know if that's a familiar concept to most of your listeners out there. And there's different things that book packagers do, but one thing they do is they hire writers to write preconceived ideas or synopses of a story, and then they sell that package to a publisher. So my very first novels with Alloy Entertainment, a packager, were a fantasy adventure middle grade series that I wrote for Alloy Entertainment, but was published by Penguin Puffin. They sold that package to them. That means that they're a clearinghouse for writers and other writerly types. And when Jim decided to branch out into children's books, he approached Alloy Entertainment and said, "Do you have any people, in your collection of writers who might be interested in writing some like audition chapters for an idea of mine?" And I was one of the people who wrote a sample for Jim, and he liked what I had written, and it went from there. In terms of the writing process itself, I work from his. I've done a lot of co-authoring. I think my openness to that is not unrelated to my background in theater and filmmaking, which is collaborative storytelling. And with Jim, what I do is he creates an outline, detailed chapter by chapter outline, maybe 25 pages for a 40,000 word book. And then I have about 6 months for a middle grade novel. And once a month, I'll send him a chunk of, a polished first draft of that story. And we'll talk about how it's going and if there are changes we need to make, or if the outline's not quite adding up, or whatever needs to happen until we get to the end of the 6-month process. And then he'll rewrite to completion. I might be asked to do a few rewrites. Some of those books go to an illustrator and then on to the editor. So it really is a team effort.
So it's a pretty even give and take.
I've done a lot of co-authoring, and with Jim, who's such a big figure in publishing, my soundbite is I work for him. He has absolute veto power over his own ideas. When I wrote the Stranded series with Jeff Probst, the guy from Survivor on TV, he certainly knew what he was doing storytelling wise, but he'd never done books. So that was a lot more directly collaborative, and I had a little more leeway to say, that's not going to quite work. Let's try this.
I'm glad you mentioned that about Jeff Probst, because what I want to know is, how do you go about adapting a reality show for young readers?
Probably less directly than it might seem from the cover. He used to get, or he probably still does get there on season 40. He's been doing Survivor for 20 years. And the number one question he always got from kids was, when are you going to do Survivor for kids? When are you going to send a bunch of kids to an island, which from CBS Television's perspective is a potential legal nightmare just waiting to happen. So that sort of led to what could we do with this? And so we created a fictional universe and a fictional family of kids who get stranded. But we did definitely, as it so happened, Jeff hired me based on my sample of writing. But as it so happens, I'm a huge fan of that show. So we had a common knowledge, and there were definitely elements from Survivor, from the challenges, from the survival techniques that the contestants use. We definitely folded all of that in. As sort of a nod to the fans, but also without alienating people who didn't watch Survivor, but might want to read a story like that.
Your most recent book, Me, Myself, and Him, deals with parallel timelines, which can be a pretty heady subject. How do you tell a story with a non-traditional narrative?
Yeah, well, first of all, just since it's my very own novel, I'll go ahead and give it an on-camera plug. It was an unusual thing because I've been around for a long time. This was my 30th published novel, but the first one I did in that very traditional way, which is, get an idea, sell it through my agent, have my name on the copyright page, all of that. In terms of the non-traditional narrative, the original inspiration for this book was a movie called Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow. And I've always been fascinated with, I'm not a physicist or, I didn't even take physics in school, but the idea of the multiverse and the possibility of infinite parallel universes with infinite imaginable outcomes all coexisting, that informed my idea of this book. So it was really a giant puzzle. That basically what happens is the prologue of this book involves an autobiographical incident of my own from when I was working at Friendly's in 1983. And as we bored Midwestern teenagers often did, we would suck the whippets out of the whipped cream cans after work and hang out. And one night that went terribly wrong. I passed out on the cement. I broke my nose. That's the prologue of the book. That's the autobiographical part of the book. And then from there, the story splits into two outcomes. One where my character, who was named Chris as a nod to my role in this, in this character. One where he lies to his parents and sort of spends the rest of the summer trying to manage that lie. And one where he's busted and gets sent off to live with his father for the summer so he can prove to dad that the college, it's the last summer before college, and that the college is worth dad's investment of money. And in terms of managing the two, I did a lot of what I call visual outlining. Anybody who wants to look up my my YouTube channel, just Chris Tebbetts YouTube, I've got a whole little workshop on visual outlining where I use a lot of different kind of approaches and tricks to sort of getting a real, actual visual snapshot of my plot, because this one was I really had to be braided in a way unlike any other story I'd ever done. So I needed to get as many views of that and make sure that my characters, who were experiencing two different outcomes simultaneously, were not doing things that contradicted one another, but just in fact the opposite, informed the reader and to some degree each other about what was going on in the opposite timeline. I don't know if that answers your question. It was a giant puzzle and was a lot of fun, but just, yeah, bit by bit by bit. And if this isn't working, fix it again. And if this isn't working, fix it again.
So Chris, in your honest opinion, what are your most important writing tips ever?
So I knew you were going to ask this. I've been thinking about it. And I think the one I'm going to highlight at least first is something that I've been focusing on a lot most recently, including because it's something that I something that I suggest to my writing students a lot lately. And I don't hear from other people talking about it, at least not in these terms, which is paying attention to the proportion in your writing, which is to say, are you having a satisfying proportion of dialogue versus action versus internal monologue versus narration? Are you staying in the scene long enough? Or are you spending the bulk of your chapter, not moving the story forward? So looking at those proportions of those elements on the page and within the chapter and within the larger context of the book, once you get to a finished draft, to me, really, if you pay attention, and if you, my prejudice is that I want to have 70 to 80% of the text on the page moving the story forward. I mentioned Linda Sue Park before, and she thinks in movie terms like we do. And one of her formulas is a paragraph of internal monologue is sort of the equivalent of a 15-second static shot on screen, which is a long time for nothing to be happening, relatively speaking. So I try to bear all of that in mind and keep the story moving forward without stepping away from that forward-moving narrative too much, but without leaving it too bare in terms of whatever backstory or details I might need.
Something that I've noticed just writing my first book was how much it feels like writing music. Just how much of a flow you want your chapters to have.
Yeah, and that goes all the way down to the sentence level for me. I think about rhythm a lot. Just in terms of the mental flow, if it reads out, I do a lot of reading out loud for that reason. But then also, to your point, more on the macro level, the flow of plot, of just making sure that every scene, they say, every scene needs to either explicate character or move the plot forward. And then M.T. Anderson, a writer I admire quite a bit, adds a third category, which is sublime excess. Like once in a while, really go into that feast scene or that amusement park scene or whatever it is. Just, if it's just that much fun, that's fine too. But, as an exception, not as a rule.
Chris, where can people find your books?
Anywhere the books are sold. I always like for people to go through IndieBound or Bookshop before they go to some of the major retailers, just to help support our local independent bookstores. And if you want to sort of get a snapshot of everything I've written, christebbetts.com is a good place to start as well. And there are links on that page.
Fantastic. You got a great wealth of work out there. So everybody watching, I suggest you check it out. Thanks again. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode. Really appreciate it. And it's been great talking to you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thank you for everyone watching. And until next time, happy reading.